Today's question is, how did closing insane asylums lead to a new Democratic majority? As many of you know, towards the end of the 20th century, most Western countries began closing their insane asylums and replacing them with community mental health centers. This was done with the best of intentions, to get people out of these large institutions and into a more humane system of care that emphasized community integration and treatment. But it turned out that this policy had an unintended consequence. It led to a massive realignment in American politics. First, if you enjoy these videos, please subscribe and consider supporting me on a platform. Your support helps me make better videos and do more of what I do. Second, while I think this topic is fascinating, I am not a historian or political scientist. My knowledge of this topic comes from observing the news and seeing the current-day Democrat Party. Anyway, back to the question at hand. So here's how closing insane asylums led to a new Democratic majority. When people with severe mental illness were institutionalized, they were largely out of the public sphere and therefore not really participating in politics. In fact, it was generally believed that people with severe mental illness shouldn't vote. It was seen as a sign of incapacity. Now, asylums weren't great places to be, but they were places where people could be cared for and, in some cases, rehabilitated. But asylums started to close and people with severe mental illness started to re-enter society. They brought with them a new way of thinking, a new worldview that had been largely absent from public discourse up until that point. See, inside these asylums, people would talk about things like lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy, and they would ask each other, "Why are we here? What is wrong with us?" And the answer they always came to was, "We have nothing to offer society. We are inherently worthless, and so we should be put away, locked up, forgotten about." This became known as the medical model of disability, and it was incredibly influential, so much so that it became part of the fabric of American culture. And when people who had been lobotomized or undergone some other form of treatment walked out into the world, they brought this worldview with them. They were now living, breathing examples of the idea that people like them, people with severe mental illness, are inherently worthless. And this idea found fertile ground in the counterculture movement of the 1960s and 70s. Here were people who were questioning the status quo, the traditional values and beliefs that had dominated American culture for decades. And what better way to do that than by questioning the value of those who had been deemed worthless by the medical establishment? This is why closing insane asylums led to a new Democratic majority. The people who were released from these asylums were largely poor and uneducated, and they found a home among the counterculture movement. They were able to organize and mobilize around issues that affected them directly, like access to health care and affordable housing, and this led to a realignment in American politics. The working class, which had traditionally voted for Democrats, started voting Republican, and a new Democratic coalition emerged, one that was made up of people who had been largely ignored by politicians up until that point, people with severe mental illness. Closing insane asylums led to a new Democratic majority. But before I can explain, I need to tell you about something called the lobotomy loophole. We're talking schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression. These are people who, left untreated, would often end up homeless or living in poverty, unable to work or contribute to society in any meaningful way. But then in the 1990s, spurred by a desire to reduce government spending and influenced by a then popular book called Closing the Gap, many states began closing their mental health institutions and transferring patients into group homes in the community. Sounds like a great idea with the best of intentions. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, almost everything. Asylums were closed, patients were released, and no one took responsibility for providing them with adequate treatment or housing. And so what happened next is truly tragic. People with severe mental illness ended up on the streets, in emergency rooms, or in jail. In fact, between 2005 and 2013, the number of adults with a serious mental illness who were either incarcerated or homeless increased by over 50%. 50%. An increase of more than 50% in just 8 years. So, who are we really helping by closing these asylums? Not the patients, that's for sure. But we did help a small group of people avoid responsibility for the most vulnerable among us people, who, through no fault of their own, require a level of care that we as a society are no longer willing to provide. And this is where the lobotomy loophole comes in. You see, when a patient is declared incompetent, which is often the case for those with severe mental illness, they lose their right to vote. So if you're someone with a severe mental illness who ends up on the streets after being released from an asylum, chances are you're not going to vote for anyone. Now, here's where things get really interesting. The party that benefits most from this tragic situation is the Democratic Party. Why? Well, first of all, the shift away from institutionalized care towards outpatient care has led to a proliferation of community mental health centers, which are overwhelmingly staffed by Democrats. In fact, a study found that counties with more mental health centers per capita have become more Democratic over time. And that makes sense, right? If you staff these centers with Democrats, of course they're going to vote for Democrats. Well, of course, these days, many of these patients aren't even alive to vote. Between 2000 and 2015, the life expectancy of a homeless person with a severe mental illness dropped from 55 to 47 years old. That's a 50% reduction in life expectancy. So, by closing these asylums and failing to provide adequate community-based care, we've created an entire generation of severely mentally ill patients who aren't around to vote, which means we don't have to worry about their vote. And this has given the Democratic Party a significant electoral advantage that will only grow in the years to come. So there you have it. By closing insane asylums, we created a new Democratic majority. This is the host with Explain America. Thank you so much for watching this video.